Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos America, the Uncertain webinar, featuring data and trends shaping the Biden administration. Today's webinar is being presented by Chris Jackson. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, you may submit questions online using the Q&A feature. Time permitting, we'll answer questions at the end of today's session. However, if time runs short, then your question will be answered by email. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be directly emailed to you. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and senior president of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us to our July edition of the Ipsos Inside Track webinar, where we talk about the latest and greatest in our public opinion data. Appreciate you joining us today. I've got a lot of data and material to go through today, but as always, if you do have any questions, I encourage you to use the Q&A field in the GoToMeeting app, and we will always be available. If you do have questions, you can always shoot us an email. I'm at chris.jackson@ipsos.com. Hit me up on Twitter at JCBJackson. And you can find all of our research on the Ipsos website, ipsos.com/news and polls. But today, let's dive into our data. And like I said, we have a lot to go through. I want to talk a little bit about public opinion around the economy and some of the different facets of what we're seeing in the economy, then sort of look at the pandemic and sort of America's reemergence from the pandemic and some of the sort of the lingering effects of that, and then jump into a couple of the sort of the hot button issues the country is wrestling with right now, including crime and police, critical race theory, and then just the latest in our political tracking data. And then, of course, we'll save some time at the end for questions. So again, if you have any, please don't hesitate to go ahead and chime them in at any point into the Q&A field. But before we get into that, I just want to have this one data point showing the main issue facing society. This is from our Reuters Ipsos tracking, weekly tracking, and this is as of last week. And you can see that there isn't really a single dominant issue dominating debate in American society. The economy and jobs is sort of the, about 1 in 5 Americans are listing that as their main issue, but there's not really anything that a majority of Americans are saying that's the thing. And that's different than what we've really been seeing for the past year and a half when COVID, public health has really sort of dominated the debate. We're really sort of returning back to a sort of a situation like we were in before the pandemic, where Americans are sort of concerned about lots of different things. And I think that sort of is coloring the shape or the type of debate we're having right now, where there isn't really any one area we're all talking about. We're all talking about lots and lots of different topics. And that's because there's not really one thing we're all worried about equally. It's lots of different things people are concerned about. But going into that thing that we sort of have, the plurality saying is the main issue, the economy. And I want to first start off with some of our data points talking about sort of the macroeconomic issues. This is our consumer confidence tracker, the Refinitiv Ipsos Consumer Confidence Tracker. It's built on a global survey, monthly survey of consumer confidence. And then since the pandemic started, we've been supplementing that with a weekly series in the United States. And I wanted to really point one thing out to you. So after the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, it took 7.5 years for consumer confidence to recover back to the point it was at when the recession started, sort of the peak before the beginning of the recession. And hell, even going from the beginning of the downturn to the bottom of the downturn was a 2-year process. That's how long it took consumer confidence to sort of get to that bottom before bouncing back up about 5 years later, back to sort of recover. That's totally different than what we're experiencing right now, right? What we're experiencing right now is essentially over a month period, not even a month, like 2-week period, really. Consumer confidence absolutely collapsed last late March, early April, as the shutdowns went into effect with the coronavirus pandemic. And then since then, we've seen consumer confidence relatively consistently going back up. And then this year, particularly this spring, we've seen a very pronounced spike in consumer confidence that has essentially erased all of the losses that we had experienced last year. And that's essentially over the course of a 12-month period from March last year to March this year. And that is a dramatic turnaround in sentiment over a very short time span. I know it feels like a long time, this last year sort of felt like an eternity, but like compared to the Great Recession a decade ago, the economy crashed and then rebounded really fast. And I think it's important to keep that in mind and keep sort of American sort of perspectives of that and experience of that in mind when we're thinking about sort of other economic factors, because people are essentially trying to adapt to rapid changes that aren't necessarily the same as what we've experienced a decade ago in the Great Recession. And one of those rapid changes are some of these price pressures that people are seeing, and you've probably seen a lot of discussion about in news reports about inflation. There's lots of sort of economic ideas about what's driving inflation. I'm not an economist. I'm not going to speak to that. But we are seeing that Americans are feeling it, right? They are seeing that a lot of things are more expensive or feeling like they're more expensive, particularly things like gasoline, which honestly always feels more expensive. You can ask that question anytime. People are going to think that gas is expensive. But even sort of across other things, you see majorities across most categories feeling like prices have gotten higher, and that is sort of pinching people a little bit. They're not necessarily retrenching yet, but we have seen that consumer confidence number that I just showed you in the earlier slide really over the last 3 months has been kind of flat, right? After the really fast recovery through the spring, since April or so, since some of these inflationary pressures have sort of kicked in, has been pretty flat. And I think that's partially to do with people sort of feeling these pinches. But people don't necessarily have a very consistent view of what's causing those inflationary pressures. For instance, some people, about a quarter, are pointing to supply chain issues, some about price increases, some about government policy. But even there, you can see there's some big differences by partisanship, with Republicans sort of blaming the government for what's going wrong, and Democrats sort of being more, no, it's a supply chain issue, things like that. But again, I think it's just a good case study or good example of Americans trying to adapt to this very rapid change in sort of the economic situation, economic circumstances. And I think that's coloring a lot of how they're sort of going about their day, going about their lives, is with that sort of like need to sort of adapt to that quick change. And one of those adaptations we're seeing is actually in the job market. The job market is sort of very fermenting right now. There's a lot of activity going on. You can see sort of a lot of people sort of changing jobs. There's a lot of reports of, lots of job vacancies available. Ipsos is hiring lots of people right now, certainly. And we see that as well in our data, right? So this is from a survey we did just a week or two ago. And there's a couple of things I want to point out to you. The first one is that percent in the workforce number in the first column. That's essentially the percent of that generational cohort who are currently working. And I think that's important because when you think of the workforce, you sort of have to think about it as sort of the right types of people to have a correct understanding. And the core of the workforce right now is essentially Gen X and millennials. It's not boomers. Boomers are actually kind of mostly retired at this point. And it's not Gen Z yet. Gen Z, only about half of it is a legal adult age. About half of it's actually under the age of 18. And they're sort of more in that leaving school sort of first job thing. It's really millennials and Gen X who make up the core of the workforce. And you can see in this 72% of millennials, 78% of Gen Xers are currently in the workforce. And then when you ask these people sort of about their employment status, you get a lot of interesting sort of data points. So for instance, of the Gen Z, only about half are essentially working, of the people who are employed, are working sort of in a job that they've been at for a while and aren't necessarily looking for a new job. Now, a lot of that is because a lot of them actually have just started jobs. 17% you can see just started jobs. But there is still a big chunk, 17%, who are currently working but are interested in looking for new work. And then millennials, I think, are the key group here, right? So that's people that are 25 to 40-year-olds. They're sort of in the prime of their career. They've entered the workforce either during the Great Recession or sort of, in the last year when the economy has been so crazy. And you can see 21% of them are employed but potentially looking for new work. And then Gen X, 41 to 56-year-olds, I'm a Gen Xer, more sort of content with their jobs, and then boomers, not really looking for new things. So that ferment in the job market is really happening among that millennial and that sort of older chunk of the Gen Z cohort. Like, that's the people who are really sort of moving around it more now. I think that's important to keep in mind when you're sort of thinking about what's happening in the workforce. Is it's sort of young people who sort of come of age during sort of very topsy-turvy economic climate, who are potentially looking for different things. And what they're looking for, I think, are a couple of factors, particularly people who feel burnt out from the last year and a half, which again, it's been kind of a terrible year, so that's not surprising, and people who think that they can get more money somewhere else. And again, I think that's probably related to some of those inflationary pressures, but also just to the wages were somewhat stagnant across the last year. And this is sort of that employment picture that you're looking at, right? Is people who are either burnt out or looking for more money, or some combination of both, predominantly younger people. Those are the ones who are really moving around right now. One of the other things is this sort of return to the office. You're seeing lots of people talking about getting back into sort of formal workspaces. I'm in my office today, which is an interesting change of pace, and lots of sort of different debates happening around the topic. But I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind with the return to the office is it's still actually very strongly connected to the pandemic and coronavirus. So this is a question we asked a couple of weeks ago with how comfortable are you being indoors without wearing a mask? And you can see I'm still actually wearing my mask around my neck. But we essentially asked, how comfortable are you being inside without a mask on? And this is essentially a proxy for how comfortable are you being sort of out and about with your life during the pandemic. The people who say they're very comfortable being indoors without a mask, essentially the ones who are least sort of worried about COVID, are also the ones who are the happiest to return to the office. And among everyone else, the plurality of people in that group are kind of ambivalent about the idea of returning to the office. They're like not totally comfortable with the idea. And I think that's a strong indicator of how this sort of return to office push isn't necessarily fully an economic decision or a business decision. There are still lots of people who have health considerations and health concerns that are factoring into those decisions. And if you're someone who is in that sort of position of deciding if your employer is requiring people to be back in the workplace or not, it's good to keep that in mind, because if you're asking someone to do something that they think is going to contribute to the detriment of their health or well-being, that's potentially going to cause them to look for work somewhere else, like that previous set of slides. And we even see that in sort of more sort of routine interpersonal behavior, like shaking hands or hugging, right? People who are comfortable shaking hands, people who are comfortable hugging, again, people who aren't necessarily as concerned about COVID are also the ones who are more excited to get back into the office. So speaking of COVID, what are we seeing in our data around the pandemic? Well, the country continues to sort of reemerge. We're continuing to sort of put that sort of pandemic state of mind behind us. We're seeing that the number of Americans who are social distancing or wearing a mask at all times continues to decline. We actually have the newest wave of our Axios tracker, which we'll be publishing tomorrow. But these trends are basically sort of continuing. And then the number of Americans who are sort of going out to visit friends or family continues to climb, even though the vaccination rate, which is that dotted line, is actually sort of plateaued off. It has not really continued to go up nearly as fast as it did during the spring. And this is essentially the picture of America sort of putting the pandemic behind it, at least mentally, even if we haven't necessarily put it behind us in terms of actual cases. It is the country sort of being like, okay, we're ready to get back around to our lives. But that vaccinated group, or that anti-vaccinated group, rather, I should say, continues to be relatively consistent. About 1 in 5 Americans saying that they are not at all likely to get the vaccine. And those groups do have some sort of commonalities. Partisanship is very much sort of figuring into if people are hostile to the idea of getting the vaccine, with Republicans being much more likely to say that they're a hard pass versus Democrats. And then where they get their news from actually seems to also be a big correlate with interest in getting, or disinterest really, in getting the vaccine. And the interesting thing is we've actually seen among Fox News viewers, the number who are sort of a hard pass has actually dropped down. And it's increasingly sort of people who are getting their news from sort of alternate news sources. This includes sort of the more conservative, like the OANN type places, or people who don't really get news from any sort of, normal news source, but instead sort of get it from sort of a hodgepodge of family, friends, social media, what have you. That's really where sort of the vaccine resistant group is increasingly sort of concentrated, which is a challenge to people who are trying to get people to get vaccinated, right? Is how do you reach people who aren't necessarily even plugged into the news or media ecosystem? And indeed, we're talking to some of our clients who are part of that effort, and they were essentially saying that they're no longer really trying to talk about the issue in terms of partisanship, that Republicans are hostile to the vaccine, because that just reinforces some of the resistance if you talk about it in those partisan terms. So instead, they're very much trying to go through doctors, trusted sort of local advisors, things like that, to get people vaccinated. In addition to sort of keeping doing sort of those sort of encouragements, like giving away free beer, things like that. Or I've heard of some employers who are actually giving out essentially pay raises based on vaccination status, right? So it's not you have to get vaccinated, but if you get vaccinated, you get paid $2-3 more an hour versus not being vaccinated, because it's sort of in their interest. So there's a lot of, I think, ferment going on, trying to get that 1 in 5 Americans who are still sort of resistant, sort of converted over. And Cliff Young, who's the president of our division, actually had an article in Time magazine last week that talks about how difficult it's going to be converting that group, and that you're really going to need to start seeing people putting out some sort of like requirements for vaccination status to really get that last group of people over the finish line. And then the Delta variant, right? The Delta variant is sort of this new strain of coronavirus. It's more catching, it's more contagious. Not sure if it's actually more dangerous to people who get it, but definitely more contagious. Americans generally know what it is, but what we're seeing is that the people who are the most concerned about it are the people who are essentially already vaccinated, or the ones who say they're likely to get vaccinated. People who aren't vaccinated and are sort of a hard pass are also not really concerned about it. And this is a dynamic we're seeing in our data over and over again, that group of Americans who are hostile to the vaccine are also continuing to be sort of the people who are least likely to take protective measures around the COVID pandemic. So there's not a lot of things in place to sort of stop sort of this sort of resurgence we're seeing, sort of small resurgence in cases attributable to the Delta variant. And I said that our client isn't necessarily talking about the vaccination campaign as a partisan issue, but there is still very clearly strong partisan differences in terms of views of the vaccine. This is about vaccine passports, or the idea that you should show proof of vaccination status to do various things. And you can see that, a majority of Americans are saying you should for things that involve sort of large groups of people in closed spaces, and then sort of not necessarily majorities for sort of more routine things, but huge partisan differences between sort of the idea of showing proof of vaccination status to do stuff between Democrats and Republicans. So other issues, crime and police reform. So we were working the New York Democratic primary last month. Eric Adams ended up winning that primary, former police chief, and it was sort of seen as like a Democratic referendum on the idea of like police reform and defund the police versus sort of a more sort of, justice and security type focus. But the thing that's interesting, and the thing I want to point out, is that this sort of resurgence of focus in the media or in the American public on crime and gun violence and public safety isn't actually that out of the ordinary. In fact, if you look back to 2018, before the pandemic, it's about the same. So what we're really seeing is a return to sort of what the normal issue landscape is like once you've taken COVID out of the equation, which has dropped from, essentially being the dominant issue to being sort of one of many. So, when you're sort of seeing people talking about crime and gun violence and things like that, it's important to remember that this is actually not new. This is actually sort of a return to how things have been. And the thing that's actually interesting, this is from a data series we've done with NPR and USA Today, where we essentially ask people, we let people say up to 3 items of their main concerns, is that what's actually sort of interesting and has changed is climate change and political extremism have actually increased as major concerns, even while crime has sort of gone down and then back up, and healthcare has actually gone down a little bit over the time. And I think that's actually the interesting sort of change in the issue landscape we're seeing, is there is actually a little bit of movement. It's not that movement that you necessarily see at the headline level with crime, but I think the nature of the debate around crime has changed. And I think that's really a testament to the protests last summer after the killing of George Floyd. And I want to show you this slide from a survey we did with Axios in May that is just a great example of why this sort of ongoing discussion is happening. So this is a question we asked people: have you ever been pulled over by the police? Just about everybody has, because everybody's sped at one point or another, run a stop sign, what have you. And then we asked people essentially what happened next. And there's some huge differences by race and ethnicity. And the one I really want to point out is if the police officer removed their weapon, a gun or a taser, from its holster, not necessarily pointed it at someone, but that they removed it, right? Had it out. And Black Americans are 3 times more likely to have experienced that than white Americans. And I think that's an important thing to note, because that is a terrifying thing that have happened to you, right? To have someone with a loaded firearm brandishing it around you or near you, potentially in your direction, is terrifying. And this is, I think, just a good example of some of the differences that Black and white Americans are experiencing when it comes to policing and law enforcement, right? Because if you're 3 times more likely to have someone with a gun out, well, things happen, right? And that's how shootings happen, right? You also see Black Americans are more likely to have experienced their vehicle being searched, more likely to have experienced other police officers arriving on the scene. Again, sort of escalations with policing. And I think that is sort of that reality, that experience of that reality is what fed some of those protests we saw last summer, and has sort of fed into the views of what's going on. I'm actually going to skip ahead, where Americans are actually mostly on the same page in terms of policing priorities or policing reform priorities. Most Americans want to see more police on the streets. They want to see, more spending on police budgets, but they also want to see reform elements like requiring police-involved shootings be investigated by third-party organizations, requiring training to de-escalate situations, things like that. Majorities, supermajorities, majorities of both sides, Democrats and Republicans, supporting that. And the hot-button topic, defund the police, is only supported by a minority of Americans, including only a minority of Democrats. So there is actually, again, once you sort of get past some of the more political buzzwords, there is a lot of commonality in terms of what Americans are actually wanting to see in terms of policing, but Americans don't trust the same people to deliver that, right? So Americans actually trust the police more than they trust any sort of political figures, but when it comes to sort of the political figures who are leading the country right now, huge differences by partisanship, again, with Democrats trusting Biden and the Democratic Party, Republicans trusting Trump on the Republican Party, and very little sort of commonality in terms of sort of political decision makers in terms of who people would trust. And then just one last sort of data point I wanted to sort of highlight to you is there is an interesting phenomenon that people who have experienced violent crime are not necessarily more supportive of just spending a lot of money on policing, letting police sort of get out there. They too are supportive of police reform elements, and this is sort of the Biden-esque thing of shifting funding to social servicing, focusing on getting guns off the street, demilitarizing policing. You can see people who've experienced violent crime, a clear majority of them support that position over spend more on police and let police sort of do their jobs, which is, I just think, an interesting data point. Next hot button political topic is critical race theory. So this has been all over the news lately. It is sort of the idea, there's a lot of ideas around it, but essentially the idea that race is being taught in American schools in a way that is detrimental to white people. That's the positioning of it in sort of the news or media debate. Critical race theory is actually like a 40-year-old legal doctrine that essentially is about, like, can individual actions or policies fix a system that has racism built into sort of its structure a little bit? So, like, you know, if Black people have systemically been barred from living in certain areas by sort of redlining and how loans are given out, like a single policy is not going to fix that, right? It's a system that has to be addressed with sort of systemic fixes. But anyways, when we did this survey last week with Reuters on critical race theory, there's some really interesting things we found. One is that most people don't really know a lot about it, which again is not surprising considering it's a 40-year-old legal theory, and that is not what most Americans spend their time on. But the people who thought they were more familiar with it are also people who tend to spend time on cable news or on social media, right? So this is very much a phenomenon that has been sort of created by the news cycle as much as anything else. And then when we actually asked them a series of true-false questions, Americans are true-false questions about critical race theory, and this sort of comes from, you know, the definitions of it, there's no aspect of it that a majority of Americans can identify correctly. In fact, when we did this survey, out of these 7 questions we asked, the average person got essentially 2 correct. So not a great depth of knowledge. So again, I think when you hear people talking about critical race theory and you hear people sort of getting all carried away about it, it's just important to keep in mind that they're getting carried away about something most people don't actually know anything about. So it's sort of one of these debates that's being set up in a not necessarily based on any actual principles, but instead it's sort of people, one side debating an idea they have in their head versus another side debating an idea they have in their head, and neither of them are actually talking about the same topics or issues. But when we asked people, you know, if they got those true-false questions correct, there were some patterns that emerged that were, I guess, not terribly surprising. People who got their news primarily from Fox or conservative news outlets, who, remember, thought of themselves as the most familiar, were also more likely to get most of the answers incorrect in the survey. People who use CNN and MSNBC major newspapers, a little bit more accurate, broadcast networks, again, sort of on average. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's changing how people feel about the topic. And this is when we asked a question if people agree or disagree that critical race theory is being used to erase American heritage. This is one of the critiques we've seen against it by Republicans, particularly at sort of the local level. And you can see a large majority of Republicans agree with that statement. Even though they don't necessarily know what's part of critical race theory, they're pretty sure it's being used to erase American heritage. So you can see how CRT has sort of become essentially a proxy for the culture wars that have reemerged in American society, even if the actual topic we're talking about doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's become this proxy for sort of larger issues. But again, one of the interesting things is when you actually ask about some of those issues, again, sort of divorced of the political sort of rhetoric, you still see sort of majority support. So when we asked people, do you support teaching high school students about slavery and its impacts in the United States? A large majority of Americans say they do support that, 79%, including bipartisan majorities. And then when we ask Americans, do you support or oppose teaching high school students about racism and its impact in the United States? Again, a large supermajority of Americans support that. Again, majorities of Republicans and Democrats support that. So even though there's just sort of debate around the topic, the fundamental thing about teaching about race and slavery and racism is actually something most Americans support. So there is, I think, again, sort of this interesting sort of conflict between the rhetoric, which is very hot, but not necessarily based on anything substantive, and where people actually are, which is oftentimes cooler. And honestly, people, when they ask me what should we do about this, I refer back to that slide about people who are getting their news from social media and cable news. Like, just stop getting your news from cable news and stop getting your news from social media, and you're going to be less worked up about some of this stuff. All right, finally, American politics. So like I was talking about earlier, the issue landscape is changing. As a consequence, what people want the government to focus on is changing. COVID is declining as a main issue from earlier this year when 4 in 10 Americans said it was the number one priority to now just over a quarter. The economy is slowly sort of ticking up to replace it as the number one issue. And then sort of everything else is, again, sort of that ferment of other topics, which is, again, that what I was talking about earlier of a country where there isn't really one thing we're all focusing on. We're all focusing on sort of our own little piece. But even within then, there's still some big differences between Democrats and Republicans, with Democrats continuing to be a little bit more focused on COVID and Republicans more focused on immigration or the economy. But we are sort of entering this period where there's not really the one thing uniting everyone as the thing we're worried about or cared about. And we're sort of seeing that reflected a little bit in Biden's approval ratings, which have slid slightly from where he started earlier this year. He entered office with 56, 57% approval ratings. That has slid down now to about 52, 53 in our most recent wave. And we think that's partially just, he's been in office for a while and the honeymoon sort of fading, but also because he was always seen as strongest on COVID. And as COVID declines, something most Americans are concerned about, they're now evaluating him on different aspects of his job, and he just isn't as seen quite as strongly in those other aspects. So when we look at that, we can see COVID continues to be his strength. 2 in 3 Americans give him good numbers on dealing with COVID. That's been pretty consistent through his presidency. But as that has become not necessarily the main issue people are thinking about, they're instead evaluating him on these other aspects, like the economy, which is the third item. 53% approve of his job performance there. Racial inequality, 50%. Employment and jobs, 49%. And then immigration, 42%, third from the bottom. These are sort of the issues that people are now sort of thinking about, and Biden isn't seen as doing quite as strong on any of those topics. And while support remains extremely partisan, you can even see within partisan groups, there's some differences. So for instance, among Democrats, large majority approve of Biden's performance on COVID and pretty large majorities across everything else. But when it comes to taxation, immigration, corruption, his numbers are weaker with Democrats, still plus 52, right? Still amazing, but not nearly as strong. And I think that's, again, Democrats aren't necessarily as excited about what Biden's doing in immigration, for instance. And then with Republicans, you have the same sort of phenomenon. It's just, rather than liking, it's hating, where, particularly on things like immigration or taxation, you see huge numbers of Republicans disapproving of Biden, and that's sort of driving the views of him moving forward. So we sort of expect his approval ratings to sort of continue to trail off slightly as COVID continues to fade, hopefully, as a major issue. But, his overall approval rating on the economy is actually not terrible. It's, 50-ish%. That's actually relatively comparable to where Trump was on that measure, which was his strongest measure. So we still see that as kind of a little bit of a borderline between a strength and a vulnerability for Biden, right? And it really, I think, depends on how the economy performs over the next year or so, which way that goes, right? Does it become a strength or does it become a weakness? If the economy sort of continues to grow, if the inflation pressures prove to be temporary rather than permanent, maybe we see it become a strength of Biden. It's something that helps him and the Democrats in 2022, and if he decides to run for re-election in 2024, maybe it helps him there. I think that's sort of going to be one of the big question marks, politically speaking, moving forward in terms of big macro issues, is how does the economic recovery work out, and does Biden get credit for that? But one other political issue I just wanted to sort of point out, this is referring back to the crime survey that I was talking to you earlier. This, I think, actually reflects some of the complicated facets of contemporary politics. So on crime, Republicans have an advantage, about an 8-point advantage on who's better dealing with crime and public safety. Honestly, most Americans say neither, which is kind of a testament to how poorly both parties are viewed right now. But anyways, when you sort of have it as that forced choice, you see Republicans have an advantage. But when that frame is shifted from Republican Democrat to Biden versus Trump, that advantage disappears. In fact, Biden actually has a slight advantage over Trump. And I think this reflects sort of the challenge of contemporary politics in that, yes, there may be a situation where one side has an advantage, but that situation may change if it's viewed through a slightly different lens. And the groups that are actually causing this movement are essentially these populations of relatively unallied Americans. So white independents, you can see basically 2-to-1 think Republicans are better than Democrats on crime, but think that Biden is actually slightly better than Trump on crime. And then Hispanic Americans are basically split between Democrats and Republicans, but are about 2-to-1 think Biden is better than Trump on crime. So these are sort of these are the populations that are sort of pushing these numbers back and forth a little bit, among white Republicans, white Democrats, Black and Asian American or Black Americans, there's not really as much movement. Those groups are a little bit more static, more sort of set in their sort of support. And it's really these sort of populations which represent, 20 to 30%, 20 to 35% of the country that are really those groups that are actually kind of moving around still a little bit. So that is what we have today. Again, you can find all of our research on our website at ipsos.com/ENUS/news and polls, or you can just type Ipsos polls on your internet search tool and that'll find it. We publish, like I mentioned in previous things, we publish 3-4 polls a week, including our Axios Ipsos Coronavirus Index, which the next one will come out tomorrow. Recently, a study from the CDC actually found that our tracking poll was the most accurate tracker of vaccine uptake rates, the closest to the actual administrative data, better than a bunch of other surveys, which is very gratifying. Then our Reuters Ipsos polling, our consumer confidence tracker, Cliff has his weekly sort of Cliff's take, which is sort of just his summary of what he thinks the most important statistics to pay attention to. And then our podcasts and all the other properties we have where we're going out talking about this stuff. So again, all of this is readily available, freely accessible. You're welcome to use any of it. And at that, I think I will take questions. So if you do have any questions, please use the little Q&A field in the GoToMeeting webinar. And let's see what we have so far. All right, first question is about gas prices and inflation. It is, will higher gas prices become a drag on Biden's approval rating? So historically speaking, gas prices do have a correlation with presidential approval, a small correlation, but increasingly we're sort of seeing those delink a little bit. And what actually is going to be more important isn't necessarily gas by itself, but the broader economic agenda. And essentially, it's the idea of, do people feel like they're able to afford their lives? Yes or no? Gas is definitely a part of that, is certainly one of the ones people sort of have the most immediate sort of, they're buying on a regular basis, and they see the price in a very easy way, right, when they're filling up the car or truck or what have you. But necessarily a one-to-one linkage between increasing gas prices and decreasing Biden approval rating is unlikely to happen. But if we do see Americans feeling inflationary pressures and feeling that pinch and feeling that sort of sense that their dollar doesn't go as far, that will have a negative impact on Biden's approval ratings, because that is sort of, like I was talking about, that economic sort of indicator that could kind of go either way. That's probably going to push it towards that more negative direction and will become a drag on his overall approval rating. But it won't necessarily be that one thing. It'll be, it'll be a larger basket of issues, right? Of economic issues, which gasoline prices may certainly be a component of. Let's see, what else do we have? What are we expecting next year for the midterm elections? It's kind of early, over a year and a half out, or not a year and a half, year and a couple of months out. Midterms are generally bad for the incumbent president. So that would suggest that it will not be a good year for the Democratic Party, considering that Republicans actually control redistricting, which is going to happen this year in the majority of states. It'll probably be pretty bad for Democrats, actually. But it's, it's hard to tell, right? It's hard to tell what the environment's going to be like. It's hard to tell what's going to be motivating voters. We are sort of in the midst of a little bit of a realignment in terms of the electorate, where college-educated white suburban and urban voters who historically have been a little bit more Republican leaning than not have moved relatively decisively into the Democratic Party. And those groups turn out at pretty high rates. And Democrats have historically, in midterms, seen a fall off in their turnout rates. And I think that one of the questions is that going to continue now that there's been a little bit of this realignment in these groups, Black women and college-educated whites who have very high turnout rates are more Democratic aligned and might actually cause Democrats to turn out at higher rates. But I think Republicans are going to have the advantage. They're going to be the ones who probably, the odds are money that they'll take control of the Senate and potentially take control of the House as well. Though again, it's a year and a couple of months out. Lots of things could potentially change. Don't really know yet. All right, let's see. Next question. All right, so what are Americans looking forward to this fall? Sort of an open-ended question, but what our data has been suggesting is Americans really do have an appetite for sort of getting back to some sort of normal lives. Even people who are remaining concerned about coronavirus and COVID want to be able to do a lot of the things that they did before the pandemic. So that's, traveling, that is sort of seeing friends and family, that is sort of being able to go out and do things without necessarily with a lot of fear. So I think there is a lot of appetite for, those particularly sort of more recreational type activities that's still sort of unfolding. We've definitely seen it happening this summer, but I think it's continuing. And I think you're actually going to see that going into the fall into some of the more sort of formal structures of society. So like back to school is probably going to be a very interesting time this year, is sort of, I think, almost all American kids are going to be back in school rather than in remote learning. So I think there is a lot of appetite, a lot of desire for that to happen. And I think that's also going to contribute to what we see in terms of dealing with COVID over the next couple of months. Is it's probably unlikely that you're going to see any major changes, major restrictions on the part of government around COVID. I think the most you'll see is like mask mandate type things like we saw in LA last week, where they sort of reimposed the indoor mask mandate. But like in terms of like wholesale shutting things down, I think it's unlikely to see that, because I think there's so much appetite we're seeing in our data for people to be able to sort of get some of the structure back in their lives and be able to get back to some of that leisure activity that they've enjoyed before. All right, so that was the last question I have. Again, if you have any questions, you can put them into the Q&A field. If not, I certainly encourage you rather to shoot us an email if you do have any questions. This deck and this presentation will be posted on Ipsos's site within the day. And yeah, I appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate your interesting presentation today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. If we didn't get to your question, or you feel free to send one by email, as Chris mentioned, and you will also receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. And of course, we welcome the opportunity to speak with you, so please feel free to reach out to us. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.